You cannot have the person who removes the head of state suddenly deciding who's going to run it, because that sends a very strong signal to President Xi and President Putin. And I think it's really therefore for the United States to set out the threat that Maduro posed to American citizens and why it was necessary.
Well, to get more on that, let's speak now to the former Conservative Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Before we get into the assessment, I'd just be fascinated to know what your response was when you heard the news initially yesterday.
Well, I think there are two parts to this whole process, and you notice that the State Department is strange to talk about it from a law enforcement point of view, which is the American view that Maduro led a drugs cartel, and that extensive drug operation and smuggling posed a threat to American citizens and Americans' national interest. And that is why they took the action they did. In other words, they rendered him and your former barrister, your current barrister contributor just before the news was talking about, he called it kidnap, but we've heard it before called being rendered across borders for trial in the United States. And that's one part of it. The other part of it is this bit about running Venezuela that the president talked about yesterday in his press conference. That's the bit that's actually, in one level, much more worrying and clearly doesn't have much detail to it, because it's one thing to remove someone who poses under international law. If the lawyers say, well, he poses a direct threat to the United States national interest and the state itself won't do anything about it, then there are some areas, if it's imminent, the threat, there are some areas where legally you are able to take a certain action. The Americans believe rendition is not a problem. It's something they've done not just at higher level, they've done it at lower level. The very Beatles, if you remember the Beatles ISIS team who killed British citizens, when they were taken across to the United States for trial under ECHR, that would be viewed as rendition because they didn't go willingly and there wasn't an extradition treaty with Syria, and we wouldn't have been able to do it. In fact, we weren't able to do it, which is one of the problems we have with ECHR. So I think there are two parts to this. One is, was the Americans right to go and get someone, whether it happened to be a president, but it could have been, anybody, a cartel leader in Mexico, for example, were they right to do that and bring that person, if there was no other way of doing it, to justice? And the second one is, does the United States have the right to go and run another country? And I think that's the part that should worry us the most in the United Kingdom, and indeed would worry the lawyers the most.
And what are your answers to both of that question? Should the US have gone in and effectively abducted, kidnapped a leader of a sovereign nation and taken him to the US, albeit a dictator? Many people in Venezuela didn't want him to be in power, and the majority of people felt that he lost the election last year, but he still clung to power. Even with all of that, should the US have done that? And also, should they then be running the country until this proper transition?
I think the main question, and I had to go through this myself with people that pose direct threat and imminent threat to the United Kingdom or their citizens and their allies, which is, do you think that it is right that under international law, if a state isn't compliant, if a state is a failed state, such as Syria, or you don't have an extradition treaty, is it right that the only option you have as another state under international law to defend yourself from that threat is a lethal strike? That there's an irony that today, overnight, Britain and France struck in Syria an ISIS depot, a weapon site, probably had ISIS members in it. And as opposed to sending in special forces to go and capture the people, capture the evidence and bring them back for trial, you can't do the latter. You can only do the former under international law. So I think, I don't know what the evidence or intelligence the Americans had about Maduro and a drugs cartel, but if he was running an international drugs cartel and inflicting thousands of, lots of harm on the United States, then it is a matter of the United States to decide how it's going to deal with that threat. And it is bizarre that under ECHR, for example, European Convention on Human Rights, you can't do anything other than, if you could prove the threshold that he was directing and causing death and harm or national security threats in the United States, you can't do anything other than a military strike. You can't go and capture him and bring him for trial in an independent judiciary. And we're not the same as Russia. We have an independent judiciary, so does the United States. And I think that's an odd position to be in. Now, how they did it, and the all singing, all dancing Chinook flights and all the sort of massive, on on display is always actually secondary to what they did. They went in, they chose to take a man they believe was running a drugs cartel, put him on trial. What would we do? Well, the question is, we currently do nothing, and most people don't. And but because he's the head of state, it's definitely more sensitive. But it's been definitely done before. But I think the next bit is the wire we should worry about, which is the bit where Putin takes precedence, which is this, well, I'm now going to run the country. Well, that is very dangerous because that is a different issue from removing the person that emanates threat to your country. That's actually the same excuse that Putin uses to occupy Crimea and the Donbass, which is, oh, I'm going to have a referendum now, I'm going to take it over. And that's the bit that I worry about the most.
So does this move by President Trump embolden the likes of Putin and indeed China if they choose to take action against Taiwan?
Yeah, yes, it does, because if you look at the US national security strategy, the recent national security strategy, he talks about the Western Hemisphere. And it's very clear in that strategy that under the Trump administration, he believes in the same spheres of influence type policy as Putin. The Western Hemisphere is obviously Canada, South America, Central America, Greenland, bizarrely, and the Caribbean. And that area clearly Trump thinks is his backyard, and that he can do what he believes is right in that backyard. That would align with Putin's view of the world. And dangerously for the United States, it actually, we should remind ourselves that President Xi would see his sphere of influence is large parts of the Pacific. But I think that is really where we are with Donald Trump. Donald Trump believes in spheres of influence. I think it's why he definitely seems to align and show a form of bizarre understanding towards Putin's behavior. Yesterday's actions was very much along those lines, that this is my backyard. I don't like what Venezuela is doing. I'm going to do something about it. Look, Venezuela does pose a threat. It posed a threat to the United Kingdom on a number of occasions because it does host the IRGC. The Revolutionary Guard of Iran was often be there. We would see when I was doing my job, either that or as a security minister, of the drugs cartels were definitely having an easier ride there. And indeed, Russia would view it as it's one of its sort of proxies in that Western Hemisphere. So it wasn't a country that was definitely a friend of the United Kingdom, and it had actors within it that definitely posed a threat to us. But ultimately, it's for the United States to lay out what the threat to them was. And I think we need to ask ourselves the broader questions, which is our European Convention on Human Rights fit for purpose for keeping us safe? You know, it's not just, I'm not talking about removing leaders of countries, but what I am talking about is why was it as Defence Secretary, the only choice I had about someone posing a threat to the United Kingdom in a country that we couldn't extradite them from was to effectively kill them. There was no ability to bring someone back to put them on trial against their will, because as your barrister, a contributor said before, the 8 o'clock news, he said how you get to court in the European system is as important as when you're in court. Well, I'm not sure I always buy that. If someone is trying to kill British citizens around the world, but we think it's right that we bring them to trial, why can't we bring them back? Why couldn't we bring the Beatles back to the United Kingdom who had murdered British citizens for trial in the United Kingdom? Currently, ECHR would say, oh, well, you can't do that. That would be rendering them. And as a result, they had to go to the United States. It's one of the reasons why Begram doesn't come back, or some of her fellow colleagues, is if you bring her back, her first defense as soon as she's there is, well, you've rendered me illegally out of a state. So that's our problem.
I'm interested to get your thoughts, having served as Defence Secretary, on how the British government should respond to Donald Trump's actions, because we've heard from Keir Starmer. He said his government would shed no tears for the end of the Maduro regime, but he wouldn't be drawn on whether or not the military action has broken international law. You've spoken about that barrister we spoke to before 8 o'clock. He was absolutely crystal clear. He said this has broken international law. There's a difference, isn't there, between what you may want to say as a politician and the reality of what you can say. And presumably Keir Starmer's in a really difficult position here because he's worked so hard to build a relationship with Donald Trump. What's your assessment from a political point of view of what the British government should be doing now?
Well, I think if I was the British government, the area I would be working hard, both publicly and privately, to talk about is that other half of the Trump statement that we're going to run Venezuela, and to be clear that that is not acceptable, that another state effectively flies in and decides it's going to run another country, because that sets a very dangerous precedent. I wouldn't get bogged down in actually what's been a very long-running issue of the United States, which is this sense of rendition. They're not their only country to do it, but people need to understand why the United States have this history of rendition. Go back to a United States where the US Marshal had to go out and use bounty hunters to catch people across vast tracts of land, to cross borders and grab murderers in different states. That's been around for hundreds of years. That's what they do, because that was the only way they could administer justice. We don't have that. Now, I think your former contributors are right that under ECHR it is illegal or wrong to kidnap, as he would say, but you could say render someone across a state border in the way that it's been done. I wouldn't get into that. If I was the defense secretary, I would not get into that space. I would get into the space of, did he pose a threat that warranted that? And secondly, I think it's more for the community, either the people of Venezuela themselves, or indeed I'd look for some international body to try and help run Venezuela in absence of their president. But you cannot have the person who removes the head of state suddenly deciding who's going to run it, because that sends a very strong signal to President Xi and President Putin. And I think it's really therefore for the United States to set out the threat that Maduro posed to American citizens and why it was necessary. But the other part, I think that is a role for other organisations.
Really good to get your thoughts this morning. Thank you for joining us. That's the former Conservative Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Absolutely fascinating there. This idea that he feels that actually the idea of rendition and actually the US going into Venezuela and removing President Maduro is not the issue here. The issue here is the United States saying we're going to run the country, because that sets a dangerous precedent, which then emboldens, he did say, yes, it emboldens Russia and China, this action, which is where. A really interesting point on the European Convention on Human Rights, which I know is a big thing for Conservatives and whether or not it should be got rid of. He was saying, under international law at the moment, if the UK wants to apprehend somebody that is in a nation that basically doesn't work with us, they won't allow extradition. The only way that you can actually get hold of that person is it's illegal to go into the country and seize them, arrest them, remove them against their will and bring them to this country to go under trial. But you can bomb them and kill them. And Ben Wallace was saying that to him seems utterly ridiculous.
And really interesting what he was saying there as well about, the process is interesting. Obviously, it's no matter what you think of it, it's an incredible feat to have done this, for the American military to have done this. But actually, it's about day two. It's about what happens now and the message that it sends, as you correctly say. But also, if you're Russia and China, well, are you going to listen? And do you care about international law?
Well, this is the point that John's just said when he gets in touch. He says, please, can we get some perspective here? China and Russia don't care about international law. So the US action makes zero difference to what they will actually choose to do.